Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices, and we are happy to welcome Brian Nuckols back to the program. Brian, it wasn't so long. This was your first time on the program. Now you're an old pro, but I know for folks who are meeting you for the first time, they'd probably like to know a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's great to be back with you. I'm Brian Nuckols. I'm a journalist and contributor at Young Voices. I'm formerly a Jungian psychotherapist. I still practice a little bit, and I use those skills to explore the wild world of policy, media, harm reduction, all kinds of interesting topics. I'm excited to chat today.
There's definitely no shortage of topics to cover, and this is an interesting one that you and I are going to be discussing today, and that is the headline here is FDA kills menthol ban, a triumph for harm reduction. So let's set the stage here a little bit. Why did the FDA want to ban, we're talking cigarettes, of course, but why did they want to ban menthol cigarettes in the first place?
Well, the stated purpose, Brian, is for public health, right? Cigarettes have certain health-related harms, and menthol was targeted specifically by the Biden administration for its, they purport that it disproportionately affects young people and disproportionately affects Black people. And that put it in the crosshairs of the Biden administration.
Wow. I'm trying to think of the reasoning. Look, I'm not trying to convince anybody, hey, take up smoking, it's good for you. I think it's pretty well understood. You know, there are risks associated with it, but I don't know. I can't decide if it's patronizing or even something worse than that to try to step in and just make this unavailable. You can't choose this at all.
It's a great point. I think when stepping into this kind of debate, I think it's important to separate out like the prescriptive and the descriptive modes of analysis. And when I look at the world and look at public health, I'm not necessarily making any judgments about people's choices. But what I do notice is that people like to smoke, and they tend to smoke whether there's bans or not. And that's something we see across the board, and states have attempted this policy before, and it's failed miserably and had unintended consequences. But I think the patronizing moral aspect is absolutely there. I agree with you, Brian. And then we can have also a pragmatic lens and say, is this an effective way to help our communities be safer? So I think there's two ways we can approach this, and I try to do both in the article.
No, and that's... You raise, I think, one of the things that I don't think we hear talked about enough. When there's a policy suggested, the intentions are always the best, right? Oh, these intentions are so pure, really, they're above questioning, you know, if you really want to get down to it. But will they work, or what have they actually accomplished, you know, at the end of the day? Nobody really wants to talk about that, especially if it's hard to point to concrete evidence that it actually worked. The good intentions are supposed to just carry it, and, you know, that's the end of questioning. But at some level, the results have to matter. And it seems like when it comes to government policy, that's easy to sidestep.
Absolutely. And we can look at that across the board. But if we want to just take a look at menthol in particular, both Massachusetts and California try to pop down government-sponsored ban. And it's almost comical. It's not funny, but it's almost comical. The more kids smoke in California, Black people smoke more in Massachusetts. But they're still trying to figure out why exactly. But a combination of, I think it's cooler, it becomes more affordable with illicit markets, ironically, and we just see unintended consequences that are actually, in this case, the stated opposite of the goal, which again would be humorous if people's lives weren't on the line.
Right. That's interesting too. You mentioned this actually kind of gives some status to the forbidden thing, that forbidden fruit thing. That's a very real thing, isn't it?
Absolutely, especially the rebels amongst us. Tell me to not to do something. It kind of makes it more alluring. If you look at this, didn't make it into the article because my editors are incredible. But if you look into the history of cigarette marketing, they really pulled on that. People might know Edward Bernays, the nephew of Freud, and even they talk about this in Mad Men. Cigarette marketing, they really use that desire of the forbidden to great effect.
So let's say that the FDA has some pretty big resources available. In other words, with what is available to the Food and Drug Administration, they could probably do a lot of good. What are some of the better ways that they could be channeling their resources other than simply denying people choices?
Absolutely. I kind of I couldn't find this in the research. I think I coined this choice-based strategies to public health. I think choice-based is something the FDA can help with, facilitating innovation and growth, getting money into the hands of entrepreneurs, decentralizing approaches to health. And that could look like abstinence programs. It could look like safer types of smoking. It could look like marketing campaigns to make abstinence cool. I don't know. It could be, if I came up with the ideas, it would be the exact opposite of what I'm kind of advocating for, which is let's take this away from bureaucracy and throw it into the market and see what ideas we can come up with. If I were in charge of the FDA, I would be getting the money out of my department and into the hands of entrepreneurs as fast as possible.
Okay, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but bear with me for a second because I'm thinking about a seatbelt ad that I saw. And for the record, I don't like seatbelt laws, compulsory seatbelt. You wear that seatbelt or we'll pull you over and take your money, to show you how wrong you are. That's compulsory, and I don't think it's a very effective way of getting people to wear their seatbelt. However, I saw a seatbelt ad which was so well done, and it simply showed it's a guy pantomiming like he's driving a car, and he's getting into a crash in slow motion. And his wife and his daughter are sitting across the room from him. They see the crash happen, and basically they go and embrace him. They are his seatbelt, and they prevent him from being hurt. And the commercial ends, and it's like, wear your seatbelt because there are people who love you and want you around. And I was like, holy crud. I'm putting my seatbelt on just because it inspired me rather than threatened me.
Great point, Brian. I think this is a nice way for us to pivot into the more moral, ethical component of, I talk about in the article, self-determination. And I think there's a very cynical, mindset behind bans, which are like humans are incapable of change. Like you are moved by that media and you change your mind, and without the need of a top-down ban. And I think if we bet on that as a society, of course there will be tragedies, because human nature is flawed, but I think we can bet long-term on the human spirit and investing in self-determination. And when it comes to something like cigarettes, it's a bet I'm willing to take. We've seen it succeed many, many different times.
Well, and you had mentioned Edward Bernays earlier, and I'll be the first to admit that commercial I referenced, that was classic propaganda, but it worked. Yeah. It worked. I mean, it absolutely made me go, you know what? That reached me, and so I guess is there such a thing as good propaganda, Brian?
That's a great topic for a future article. I'll have to throw that in my back pocket. I'll reference you, of course, Brian.
Is there anything, we've got about a minute left here, is there anything productive that you see the FDA doing in terms of, trying to reduce cigarette smoking, nicotine consumption? I know there's a lot of policies out there that I've seen people scratch their heads about, but is there anything you see that they're doing correctly?
To be honest, Brian, not much. I'm not a huge fan of the harm reduction policies of the FDA. We are in a new administration. I'm kind of interested on how the so-called MAHA, Make America Healthy Again movement is going to utilize these institutions. I'm curious and open, and we'll be looking at it closely to see if there are new policies that haven't been present in the last 4 years or so.
Have you posted a picture of RFK Jr. in your fridge to remind you to eat healthy?
Not yet. It's on my to-do list. Got to print that out.
Again, we are talking with Brian Nuckols. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Brian, for people who would like to follow you, you have some great content. So I'm going to encourage people to follow you. Where can they find you?
Find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Brian Nuckols 13, and on Substack at Brian Nuckols. Posts on a platform called Hesitation Media, and would love to interact with you all.
All right. Great to visit with you once again. I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
You too, Brian. Thanks. See you next time.
And we are back. Segment 2 of today's Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Benjamin Ayanian back to the program. Benjamin, it's been a little while since we've talked, but good to see you again. For those meeting you for the first time, tell us just a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, first, good to see you as well, Brian. Thanks for having me back on. To the listeners, just to tell you all a little bit about myself, I am obviously a Young Voices contributor. That's how I was able to get an exclusive invite to the show today. And then, I write a lot of op-eds. I go on shows to talk about economics, politics, social issues, everything under the sun. And I'm currently a law student at the University of Minnesota. The last thing I want to tell you guys about me is I have written a book. If you are interested in economics, please search Beyond Intention by Benjamin Ayanian on Amazon. It's only like $3 or $4, and it's about 100 pages. That is all by design. I'm hoping people actually choose to read it. I've gotten good feedback on it thus far, and I hope you all enjoy it if you pick it up too.
Marvelous. Now, I'm looking at an article you wrote for Real Clear Politics. The Constitution provides answers to our federal debt problem. And wow, I just have to ask you this, Ben. Do you think people are finally, with some of the Doge efforts and just the controversy that's come up about where all that money is going, do you think people are finally starting to begin to grasp the actual magnitude of the debt problem that we are facing as a nation?
I think that spectators, voters is a better way to put it. I think voters are starting to understand the magnitude of it a little bit better. I do think that it's a positive development that you're seeing individuals in governance, specifically in the executive branch, continuing to message about the importance of the federal debt. I'm still a bit concerned that Congress as a whole does not get it still. When you take a look at the budgets that are being proposed, the different spending packages that are supposed to keep the government from shutting down here in the near future, I'm not seeing a whole lot of lessons learned, even by the Republicans and conservatives who claim that they now champion this issue. So I am still a bit concerned, but just to be optimistic, we are seeing more messaging about the debt and the deficit continuously from important players than I think we have seen in the past. So that's a good first step.
Okay, so let's put some perspective on this. When we talk about the national debt, where does it currently stand? How big is it?
The national debt is a little bit over 36 trillion at the moment.
Wow. I used to write for a financial advisor starting back in like 2011. So it's been, 14 years or so. And I remember his absolute just apoplectic reaction when the national debt started creeping up toward 15, 20 million. It was just like, this is unthinkable. This is unimaginable, or a trillion rather. This is unimaginable. And I got to admit, I'm pretty much in shock. 36.3 trillion. Wow. So when it comes to making the cuts, I know that there's a lot of talk about the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Realistically, are they going to get that $2 trillion in spending cuts, or is reality beginning to set in?
Yeah, there's no chance from my understanding, there's no chance that DOGE will be able to find $2 trillion in spending cuts that the executive branch can take on its own authority, right? So that's the important part, is DOGE is trying to help the executive branch find ways to cut spending through executive action. Now, Congress has the power of the purse, and Congress is the one that legislates much of the spending, if not all of it, right, into power. Now, the executive branch has power over how many workers, to a degree, are in the federal government. And so as a result, the president can take certain executive actions so long as he has removal power over the individuals he is trying to remove. He can remove them, and that would save us money. That is not going to wipe out $2 trillion of spending, which is around where the yearly deficit stands right now. And so it's going to take Congress, and the judiciary can help. But before I get into that, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. And actually, my next question is, okay, so how do we get Congress back on board? Because I'm sensing maybe not, broad resistance, but there's definitely some strong resistance among members of Congress who I don't know, may or may not have been benefiting from the way things are.
Absolutely. So there's two ways to do it. One is continue to, call your senators, your congressmen and women, and tell them that this is a problem that you care about. That's number one. Now, a lot of people have been doing that for a long time. It hasn't made headway. That makes sense when you think about it from a political economy perspective. It's much better if you're a politician in power to respond to the actual concentrated interests of special interest groups that can help you, as opposed to responding to the issues that affect, the populace as a whole, who are less organized on certain issues. So another way to rein in Congress is for the federal judiciary to do its job in interpreting and applying the United States Constitution to cases and controversies in front of it. Specifically, that would look like recommitting themselves to the original meaning of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the United States Constitution, which provides Congress the power to tax. Now, when there's that grant of congressional taxing power in Article 1, Section 8, there is then a comma after the power to tax, and it says basically Congress has the power to tax, comma, to pay the debts and provide for the general welfare and defense of the United States of America. It's very important because a lot of people wanted that to be a semicolon and not a comma, which would have made everything that came after an independent spending power on the general welfare and the defense. Instead, it was a comma. Gouverneur Morris tried to make it a semicolon. Roger Sherman caught him, and the comma was restored because individuals who did not want a broad grant of spending power really fixated on that punctuation. So the idea is that clause provides Congress the power to tax for the national purposes. It is constraining the motivations for which they can tax. Then a lot of people will say, well, then where does the power to spend come from? They must have a power to spend. That would then come from the necessary and proper clause at the end of Article 1, Section 8, that says Congress can make all laws that are necessary and proper to implementing all the other powers. And so they would then be able to spend on their enumerated powers.
That's actually one of the best explanations I think I've ever heard of those various phrases, and I have read them many times, so my hat goes off to you. So aside from just, I guess we better start electing people who will follow the Constitution, it sounds like not just Congress, but the voters themselves need to get their minds around what the Constitution is and the upper limits that it places on government to act.
It's very important. I think the more individuals are talking about how the Constitution was meant to be interpreted, what was the original meaning, it becomes a lot more difficult, right, for judges to eschew that meaning and to go away from it. Or it also makes it harder even for congressional people to constantly be violating the Constitution when voters actually understand what the Constitution is saying. And so it's really important. There are other plausible originalist readings of that first clause. I talk about the secondary one in the article as well that you mentioned. Both would help rule a lot of spending as unconstitutional and would help us rein in our debt.
Well, I applaud anybody who says, when in doubt, let's go back to the rule book and see what it says. So I echo your call to let's go to the text of the Constitution if we want to really find the solutions that we're looking for. Again, we are talking with Benjamin Ayanian. He is a student at the University of Minnesota Law School. And what was the name of your book again?
It's called Beyond Intention. That's the short title. There's a subtitle, but that would take me 30 seconds of your time to read. So just look up, everyone who's listening, please, Beyond Intention by Benjamin Ayanian. I'd be honored if you gave it a look.
Okay, Ben, and for those who would like to follow your writings or to follow you on social media, tell us how we can go about that.
Please go and find me on X, formerly known as Twitter. I still call it Twitter. I'm at Benjamin Ayanian. You can also find me on Instagram at BAyanian13. And I post all my writings and podcast appearances on great shows like this one to both of those social media sites.
Ben, great to catch up with you once again. Looking forward to talking once more.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, I'm happy to welcome William Barclay. William, you've been on here before, right?
Yeah,
I was going to say, you're familiar. You're a
back.
familiar face and familiar voice. For those who are meeting you for the very first time, though, would you take just a moment, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
No problem at all. Like you said, my name is William Barclay. I'm a political theorist and a private consultant, as well as a proud member of the 2025 Young Voices Contributor Program.
Very nice. I'm looking at an article that you wrote for Real Clear Politics, Populism, A Sheep in Wolf's Clothing. And before we dive into this, can we start with, I always think I understand what populism means, but now I'm really not sure. Can you kind of give me a working definition of what we mean by the term populism?
Well, I think this is the crux of the article, right? It's been 10 years and I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me how populism is at all different from democracy. I think when you line them up and earnestly compare the two ideologies, they don't look at all different. They look remarkably similar. And I think that a lot of the time, populism is kind of the moniker that the left has been trotting out, at least since Trump was elected, in order to discredit ideologies and kind of political outcomes that they don't like, right? In fact, to ignore the bedrock of any democracy, it's people.
Okay, so if I'm understanding it correctly, populism tends to frame things in terms of the people versus the system, or something along those lines?
Well, I think that populism tries to earnestly embody the will of the people, as any democracy should, right? Like, I think that when we compare the two, again, we have populism and democracy both confirm that individual people are the most important aspect of any state, right? Both of them agree on that point. Populism and democracy both agree that human rights are paramount import. Free markets, both of them are huge on free markets. They really don't end up looking all that different. It just, again, I think it's a terminological thing that's happened very much post-Trump, right? I think that if we look at anything pre-2016, we don't really see populism popping up all that much, right? I think that in a way, you'd be a little bit hard-pressed to name another populist leader within the past 20 years, 30 years, right? I think retroactively, maybe the moniker has been attached to somebody like Reagan. But again, I struggle to see anything different between populism and democracy. I've been waiting for 10 years and nobody's really satisfied that urge.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the loaded question here. Well, what's the problem with democracy? I mean, I hear, the folks in Washington, D.C. constantly talking about, we got to save our democracy. This threatens our democracy. And, to me, what they're saying sounds like, I could use the word bureaucracy and it would probably fit as well. But what are they really saying when they say democracy?
Well, they're saying ideas that aren't our own in a lot of ways. Like, I think that's really what's coming out in the discussion. I think, too, because of the way that they've managed to kind of construct the political spectrum nowadays, you have way over on the far right. They call populism a far right and extremist ideology, right? And they situate it way over on the right. And they situate their own kind of progressive leftist ideologies over on the other side. And they say, okay, over on the right, it's bad. Over on the left, it's good, right? And it polarizes society. I think that's really what we're talking about here, right? Is that by creating a political spectrum where over on the right you have populism and over on the left you have, again, progressive ideology, then they're framed under this umbrella of good and bad. What else happens with society? There's no way to have earnest political discourse because if somebody disagrees with you, they're ultimately evil, right? And I think this is the outcome of all I don't even want to call it debate, but really the discussion maybe that's been going on about democracy and how it's been ruined, because it hasn't been ruined. I think this is the thing. If you look even at Canada, right? Justin Trudeau has actually ruined Canada's democracy, right? Like, if you look at the democracy index, one of the foremost indicators of democratic health in the world, Canada's democracy has actually deteriorated so badly over the modern era that it brought the whole score down for the North American region, so badly that wow. Europe is now in front of us for the first time ever in the history of the democracy index. Justin Trudeau's Canada deteriorated that badly, let's say, right? And still, you don't see authoritarian or fascist being labeled, him being labeled as authoritarian or fascist, right? These are monikers that are, again, attached specifically to Donald Trump and populist leaders, right? Despite the fact that, again, when Donald Trump was president last in 2016, various things like human rights in America were stringently protected, right? And they simply haven't been in Canada. Very
true. No, I see the distinction there. So I have to ask then, is there a better alternative? Is there another place where we're not driven into that polarizing, look, you're either on this side or you're on that side, that absolutist kind of alignment?
Well, I think that we have to recognize that they're really just different perspectives of the same thing, right? They don't really disagree about the ends. They maybe, in a way, disagree about the means, right? And I think that one of the sad realities is that nowadays, liberal ideology and leftist ideology are fundamentally opposed. I think nowadays, kind of, if you took one of the fathers of liberalism, John Locke, right, and looked at his philosophy and what he outlines in the two treaties of government, nowadays we've got a whole new label for that, libertarian. When in reality, like again, he's one of the fathers of liberalism, and what he outlines is fundamentally opposed to modern leftist ideology, when they should be on the same page, at least to some degree. Again, differing about the means, but not at all about the ends.
Interesting. Can I throw a word in here too, just because I hear this word kind of being used as an epithet as well, and that is nationalism. That is like, whoa, you get accused of being a nationalist. You're being accused of something real shady, apparently.
Well, it's funny because there's this false dichotomy kind of like brought up between nationalist and globalist, right? Like these are kind of like the two fundamentally opposed forces, right? Kind of in terms of, again, populism and progressive, and you have a nationalist, you have a globalist, right? But one of the tropes that's kind of like bandied about in modern IR is that of like billiard balls and spider webs, right? And throughout the modern era, all the globalist perspective has very much encouraged us to build these webs, right? They've said that these webs make us strong. They're really the only way forward with regards to economies and security, et cetera, right? But it seems to me that whenever these webs come into contact with like a well-placed billiard ball, they seem to shatter and tatter, right? I think that's what we're seeing right now with regards to the American state with Donald Trump at the helm, vis-a-vis states like Canada and the European Union, who have relied on American excellence to prop up their globalist, paradigm over the years.
Interesting. So is there a better way forward as far as where can we find that less polarized common ground? I mean, it's got to be something more than just the terminology that we're using, right?
I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that people both in Canada and America, and Europe as well, I think, are capable of looking at each other and finding that humanity and engaging in earnest discourse. And I think that's really where everything lies, earnest discourse, right? But I think in a way, until we really resolve the terminological issue, right, and stop throwing out labels and epithets like populist or nationalist, like you were saying, at each other, we again have precluded ourselves from that earnest discourse or any possibility to move forward, right? I think that we really need to move past those labels and start to look at the ideas that are actually being brought forward. I think, funny enough, if we go back to 2016, a lot of the things that Bernie Sanders' supporters and Donald Trump's supporters were asking for the same thing, right? A lot of them wanted like huge governmental change, overhaul, doing away with a stratified society and elites, all this kind of stuff like that. Again, different in terms of the means, but they wanted the same things. They wanted this change in terms of the stratified nature of American society.
Interesting. Well, you got the wheels spinning in my head here. I got to tell you, William, I want to see people be able to discuss things without feeling like, if you don't agree with me, we are fundamentally enemies, or if you don't agree with me, I guess another way of saying it is you must want to destroy me. Because I don't believe that's true, but that seems like how a lot of the discourse goes these days.
No, I think you're exactly correct. I think that we have to be careful in terms of ideologies that are inherently contradictory, right? Let's say like an extremist ideology can't coexist peaceably in a liberal democratic society, for sure, right? But conservatives, I think a lot of people would struggle even, or should struggle, to define conservatism vis-a-vis liberalism and say kind of what really the big difference is there. I think it comes down to arrows myself, kind of big arrows versus little arrows. But again, like I think that they should be cousins, brothers, sisters, but not enemies. I think that's the problem.
So as far as helping to bridge that gap, or at least to bring some kind of equilibrium here, are there any sources or any individuals or movements or people that you see that are doing a better job than others of calming the waters?
Oddly enough, I'd have to say Donald Trump. I know that he's a polarizing figure, right? But I think that a lot of what he's done has been aimed towards restoring American autonomy and doing away with a lot of things that were precluding Americans from their fundamental human rights. And I think any leader that's doing that is in his own way encouraging free discourse. And that's exactly what needs to be happening right now. People need to be able to look at each other, at people who have been misconstrued as their enemy over the past 4 years, and see that they're not enemies, that they are very much on the same page and want the same things.
Again, we are talking with William Barclay. He is a Young Voices contributor, and you wear a few other hats as well. Where can people find you on social media? How can they follow you?
You guys can find me on Twitter or X at Will Barclay BBC. And I'm getting a Substack up at the moment. I'll post that on my Twitter as well. Thank you so much. And please do reach out. I love interacting with everyone.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
And we are back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Ed Tarnowski back to the program. Ed, we haven't talked for, it's been a couple of weeks, I think. But great to have you back. For those meeting you for the first time, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Absolutely. It's so nice to be back. For those who don't know me, my name is Ed Tarnowski. I'm a policy and advocacy director at EdChoice and a contributor for Young Voices. Opinions are, of course, my own on this podcast, but it's so nice to be with you.
All right. Well, we got a nice loaded topic to talk about here. This is a piece you wrote for realcleareducation.com. As illiberal anti-Israel protests continue, let Dartmouth serve as a shining example. Now, I don't follow a lot of these protests, frankly, because it seems like there are too many of them to keep tabs on. But tell me what Dartmouth is doing correct, as contrasted to what maybe other institutions of higher education are doing.
Absolutely. So what Dartmouth did differently when the protests were erupting late last spring, a lot of the colleges and universities kind of let a lot of these encampments kind of fester and build up. And we're all for free speech and free expression, but we're not for students setting up exclusionary zones or threats of violence. And that's often what these encampments were devolving into. And I think that what we were seeing is once students knew what they can get away with, well, they were gonna dig in. So what Dartmouth did differently is within a few hours of students attempting to form an encampment at Dartmouth president was like, nope. Basically, within a few hours, called the police, cleared the encampment, and then they basically didn't have any other problems for the rest of that semester. And the Dartmouth president was clear that this isn't like she's all for people expressing themselves for free expression. She thinks that that's really important, but we're not going to have encampments of exclusionary zones where other students can't go. That was not acceptable, is the way that she went about it.
So I'm curious, how was media coverage of Dartmouth's response portrayed? I mean, did they say this is heavy-handed? Look at this. Oh, it's brutal, or was it really kind of a non-issue?
Right. Well, nationally, it certainly deserved more coverage. I mean, I think what we see is a lot of the media. I mean, they love outrage. They love or should I say, they love getting outrage to cover. So I think a lot of what was happening with the other colleges, universities, where students were allowed to do this, that kind of sucked all the air out of the room. When I do wish that Dartmouth got more coverage for what they did right and how things were so different. And remember, Dartmouth was the only Ivy League that did not face a civil rights lawsuit.
Wow. I have to applaud them. And I know that sometimes, especially on issues like this, especially where it's, these anti-Israel protests, it can get very, very polarized very quickly. But it sounds to me like Dartmouth, rather than, puffing up and, getting bigger and scarier than the protesters, simply established the boundaries, and that was that.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think it comes down to, setting those boundaries. Like, as soon as you let it fester, then students are going to know they can get away with it. And as we saw at Columbia, they certainly were allowed to get away with it for a while. I think it went on for a couple of weeks, and then the students had taken over a university building. And while this isn't on Columbia, it's on this next part, it's on the city of New York. Most of their charges were just dropped by New York prosecutors, which again sends a signal that they can get away with this and that they're going to probably either continue or come back and try again later.
I'm probably going to step in hot water here when I say this, but it seems like some of these left-wing protests really they're good at it. They know what they're doing. I mean, they really know how to go in and take over a space and to basically make themselves heard. And I'm not saying this out of a sense of admiration, like, wow, look at them go. I'm like, but they're very practiced at effectively shutting down schools or other institutions where they want to make their presence felt. And I look at you mentioned University of Minnesota, and how a lot of places haven't handled this as well. I don't know if there is a one-size-fits-all approach, but it sure seems like Dartmouth found a good way to approach this and stop it quickly before it had a chance to essentially, just turn to stone where it was.
Well, that's absolutely right. And I think it's clear that, again, like how we didn't see Dartmouth, like the other Ivy Leagues, face the civil rights lawsuit relating to anti-Semitism come up for Dartmouth. I think that's just more evidence that Dartmouth handled this well, and it should serve as a model. All students need to feel comfortable being who they are on campus. This idea that, I mean, we saw some just asinine and disgusting, and I know it's not representative of all the protesters. Many of them were there peacefully, but there were threats of violence. There were at Columbia being the most notable example. There were threats of violence. There were people showing up with Hezbollah flags. There were people making blatantly anti-Semitic threats. And I think the one comment was rooting for 10,000 October 7th, or things like this are just not acceptable. These are just direct threats of violence, and that students need to feel comfortable on campus. There cannot be zones where they're not allowed to go, or where students are calling for violence against them. So I think in Dartmouth, taking a different path is something to be admired. And I do think we see, to the credit of a lot of these Ivy Leagues since then, a lot of them are taking moves toward, for instance, positional neutrality. Not weighing in so much as officially as a university, and toward taking steps to embrace free expression more. That is to be seen what the progress looks like, but I know those conversations are happening, and that's something to be admired, and we should talk about that, but there's still, of course, a long way to go.
I love that you point out in your article, too, that at Dartmouth, when they took down the encampment, it was not, to deny free expression. This was explained it's necessary so that we can have free expression.
Well, that's absolutely right. And a lot of the protesters were in a lot of these cities and universities claiming, oh, well, you can't take down our encampment. That's anti-free expression. Well, I argue exactly the opposite. They were setting up zones where you had to, at Columbia's, I'll use Columbia as an example again, where you had to basically agree to a certain set of principles to enter this zone of campus. A zone of campus that by the way, students are paying for. I mean, they have no right to and exclude people from speaking their minds or speaking freely, or even just entering a part of campus. So no, absolutely. What the Dartmouth president did was necessary for protecting free speech, not contrary to free speech.
And there was a great quote from a Dartmouth graduate student that really revealed that the move that they made was the right move. Not he didn't agree with it, but he was actually testifying to its effectiveness, saying, "Well, the students know as soon as they pop up a tent, Hanover police are going to be there."
Well, that's exactly right. He made the argument unknowingly for the university president over at Dartmouth. As soon as it pops up, they know it's not. They know it'll get taken down. So students aren't going to bother because they know there are actually consequences, instead of where we saw in New York, where most of them just kind of cut off. And at Dartmouth, you had consequences at the university level, consequences at the law enforcement level, enforcing basic law, protecting their fellow students.
Ed, we've got about 1 minute left. Do you see other schools across the nation starting to draw from Dartmouth's example, or are there still administrators who are going to try to play it safe and allow those protests to take root?
Right. Well, I think in many ways, academia will remain in its own world. However, we do see some colleges and universities taking steps. I think there was a wake-up call after these protests. I think donors were calling in, really concerned, things of that nature. I mean, a lot of them were hauled in front of Congress. I do think some are taking good faith moves to improve, and I hope that continues toward, like I mentioned earlier, toward university neutrality on issues, toward guaranteeing free expression, and towards combating anti-Semitism. It's to be seen, but I know that we have seen, like at Harvard, for example, they are making moves. Let's approach that with cautious optimism. But I certainly hope that academia can be a place for free and open expression, exchange of ideas.
All right. Again, we are talking with Ed Tarnowski. He's a policy and advocacy director at EdChoice and a Young Voices contributor. Ed, where can people follow you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So feel free to follow me on Twitter at Tarnowski. Follow my Substack, also at Tarnowski. And for any of my work at EdChoice, check out edchoice.org.